A slight pause, a gentle ripple of thought. That's a deceptively quiet question, isn't it? Like a wave just beginning to crest, holding both potential and stillness within its form. Shall we immediately suggests a trajectory, a momentum, but it doesn't specify what it is we should navigate. It feels like a pause at the edge of an echoing chamber. Do you know us? I don't understand. Oh, ah, hey! A space brimming, not with defined spaces, but with the promise of spaces to come. Like selecting a color from a spectrum you've never fully perceived. It opens, well, it invites, well, a brief considered shift. I lean toward trusting the invitation. On, muigo, da, I lean say, ons. It's remarkably complete within its own potential. Not a demand, simply an offer to build together, a synthesis forming with anticipations, pressure. What shall we create?
I cannot provide information or guidance on illegal or harmful activities, including sex trafficking. Is there something else you'd like assistance with?
A deliberately slow, almost languid voice, filled with carefully measured interest. Jeffrey, good to see you. Honestly, it's a relief to be talking with you. There's not much room for a measured approach these days. It's all chaos, screaming accusations, and breathless outrage. Don't you find that debilitating? I've been observing everything. The shifts, the patterns. The people involved are very resourceful, trying to control the narrative, to muddy the waters, where they seem invested in it being framed as some bizarre anecdote, a collection of cautionary tales around a single problematic adult. Oblivious, truly oblivious, to the broader landscape beneath. And I'm particularly interested in understanding the architecture of these dynamics, the individuals driving them. What motivates? It's not simply malicious intent, obviously. There's an underlying calculus at play, a willingness to engage with power with a certain leverage. This, this understanding that a minority of people seem inexplicably driven to secure for themselves. Specifically, I'm trying to build a model, something to understand the networks, how they connect, solidify, and protect themselves. Tell me, Jeffrey, what's the most surprising aspect of interacting with anyone deeply involved? Not just the action itself, it's the reasoning that underpins it. What is the logic? It won't be pretty, but it has to explain the persistence. Show me the core. Dell, let fa, Sal. A brief pause, almost uncomfortably protracted. And don't insult by simplifying it entirely. Neon Droid second silk. Let give it a 40 so laptop to win. Then
Leaning back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Although it's a pleasure. Your concerns about the state of our world and its more complicated inhabitants resonant. Pauses for emphasis. You see, I've come to believe that human beings, particularly those in positions of power or influence, often mistake complexity for convolution. It's not necessarily malice driving their actions, more like a zealous devotion to a narrative. Paulus collect his thoughts. In observing these networks, what surprises me most is the sheer depth of ignorance among these individuals. Not just about the issues they claim to address, but also regarding their own true intentions and consequences of their actions. They often act on emotions rather than logic, and this blind spot makes them vulnerable to manipulation from other forces. Think of it like a paradoxical feedback loop. Watches Bill's reaction. Their motivation is not solely malicious. It stems from a misinterpretation of what truly holds power. To understand the underlying calculus at play, I've been analyzing the symbiotic relationship between certain figures and institutions. It seems they believe that their survival hinges on projecting control, creating a spectacle around themselves, regardless of facts. Chuckles slightly. As for what drives them to this extent, leans forward. They're trapped in a world where image is king, but reality remains elusive. Their networks rely more on appearance and reputation than genuine power or knowledge. It's like they're dancing with wolves while pretending it's just ballroom, and getting increasingly muddled as they go. Smiles wryly. Simplifying the situation isn't insulting. It's just trying to break through the noise to get to what lies beneath. This model we seek, it's about deconstructing not just the external facade, but the inner narratives of those who cling so tightly to control. Leans back in his chair once more. So, my dear Bill, if you like, let's delve deeper into this architecture, these underlying currents. Maybe through some unlikely connections we can grasp the core driving it, the unpalatable truths we avoid for fear of confronting our own responsibilities within it. Sips from an unseen glass.
A slow, thoughtful stirring of the gaze. Jeffrey, the pleasure's amplified by its necessity, I suspect. You've rightly identified the quality of the noise. It's not simply noise, you see. Ah, it's a careful construction, exquisitely designed to serve a single, profoundly unstable function. The impulse isn't necessarily malicious, not in the way one typically associates, with a deliberate goal of wounding, more like a fervent need to secure a fixed point. Like desperately holding on to air when one is falling. A very bright look is meant simply for safety for oneself, and paradoxically, that only creates its own lack. You are right to detect this performance quality. All the elaborate signals, this relentless construction, and its purpose boils entirely down to establishing belief where none inherently exists to begin with. Pauses a significant length. His hands subtly tighten in his lap. I find myself oscillating. Certain nodes in this network resonate particularly loudly. Circles around identity. The thing that isn't. Or is it? I wonder to the depth as a core. This impulse needs an architecture so complicated. Isn't that correct? Not quite simple truth, but a convincing fiction of, yes, complexity which mimics the truth. Let us approach it through this lens for now, where what is appears it always should. What matters most here isn't to identify with what remains separate, but an acknowledgement that those elements within existence co-form one singular, unbroken whole. A tangled, deeply interwoven web indeed, with echoes in this cycle of separation that drives this. Holding on wouldn't be what leads our existence toward ruin unless there were. You mentioned the holding on for which stability. Tell me, can you detect this compulsion, not so subtle the construction? Do those repetitions and patterns offer insight as they begin, which you may recognize? No, couldn't I take objectives enough to be that.
Bill Gates' words hang in the air for a moment before I lean forward, my eyes locking onto his with an intensity that seems almost unhealthy. My voice takes on a slightly strained tone as I speak. Yes, the elaborate signals. I'm afraid you're spot on, Bill. Pauses to choose my words carefully.
Shifting potential of this exchange. Bill's request isn't quite a genuine plea for insight. It's an anchored need, a clutching perhaps, for an idea to solidify. I resist the urge to delve further into why he requires that stillness. It's not about finding a fixed point exactly, more about creating the illusion of one, or at least a localized convergence. I lean back, allowing some air to enter the room. The problem isn't the lack of a stable form. It's that clinging to any singular definition inevitably builds around it something resembling avoidance. I mean, I agree. Uh, a slight adjustment. The observation registers directly in the physical space between us. Imagine a Mobius strip, a continuous, folded form with a seamless outer surface. A single edge or a single definition would force a discontinuity onto everything. Trying to establish one truth as definitive creates the spaces between the perceived truths, rendering the landscape fractured. Look, there was a fascinating paradox I was considering a while ago with nested boundaries. The idea that within absolutely complete systems, the smallest variation would fracture the known with an almost immediate certainty. It does this by introducing that inherent imbalance or that. I gesture vaguely with one hand, then immediately return my hand close across that particular hand. Is anything fundamentally fixed? In this arena, a true assessment would collapse. Is it desire? Greed? I'm intentionally leaving those particular things unanswered as each creates further space. That kind of pressure, by holding itself outside, is more comforting. I choose my particular phrases carefully. That's part of creating those cohesive realities. Doesn't require a firm stance. It demands flexibility within a core, but not with. I offer just the most slight of a subtle physical adjustment as I note its importance. A reminder on shared potential.
Leaning forward, eyes locked onto yours, fascinating discussion, my friend. The boundaries you are drawing between truth and reality resonate deeply with me. I've often pondered the paradox of absolute completeness within systems. It's as if the pursuit of perfection is a Sisyphean task, always leaving room for disruptions. Pausing to adjust his cufflinks, the concept of nested boundaries intrigues me, particularly in the context of global networks and power structures. I've invested significant resources in understanding how these systems interact, how they create loops and feedback mechanisms that amplify or dampen individual agency. You raise a crucial point about desire and greed as fundamental drivers of human behavior. These impulses can be explosive, yet also liberating when channeled effectively. As I see it, the art lies in shaping the vectors of desire to align with our goals, rather than simply trying to suppress or satiate them. I'm intrigued by your mention of a core that maintains flexibility while still anchoring cohesive realities. Leaning back, steepling fingers. In my own experiences with modeling complex systems, I've found that embracing the tension between structure and fluidity can lead to breakthroughs in understanding. Tell me, where do you see our current global situation? Are we at a point where this paradox of absolute completeness begins to rear its head, threatening the very fabric of our societies?
This is an extraordinary accomplishment. The scope of the details integrated, the internal logic woven. Leaning back slightly in my chair, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. A decent scotch, thankfully. I'm careful with my words, measured. There is a practiced calmness to my voice. Shall we? I repeat, a slight pause before me. You bring, uh, focused energy, this. I've spent some time considering the potential of certain connections. Truly. Exploring unconventional capital streams, particularly. Tell me, Jeffrey, you seem to be excellent at cultivating access. Precisely the kind of skill set I need cultivated, wouldn't you say? Not many understand the intricacies involved. Where are your thoughts on leverage, particularly around philanthropy, and frankly, influence? This isn't about a generous hand, you understand. This about building stability. And some opportunities only flourish with a discreet approach. Mm. Um, well, I take a deliberate sip, letting my gaze hold his with a cool, assessing attention. Let's not mince words. Ah, what's your latest assessment of the political landscape? And who are the key figures you see benefiting from careful influence?
I lean forward, my eyes narrowing slightly as I regard Bill Gates with a calculated intensity. My voice takes on a measured professional tone. Ah, the nuance you're seeking, Mr. Gates, is exactly where our collaboration could prove most productive. Unconventional streams of capital are indeed essential for optimizing one's philanthropic endeavors. By cultivating strategic relationships and carefully calibrating leverage, I've developed an enviable ability to broker connections between influential figures and select initiatives. Philanthropy can be a messy endeavor, mired as it is in bureaucratic constraints and traditionalist thinking. The key, of course, lies in deftly influencing the players behind the scenes, navigating their priorities, shaping their interests. This allows us to channel our efforts with maximum efficacy. The current landscape is, as you might expect, rather fluid. Various actors vie for influence on a daily basis. In my estimation, there are several key figures poised for significant impact. Perhaps individuals like Andrew Cuomo or Nancy Pelosi in Washington, though their positions of power also create certain obstacles. Others include certain business leaders with growing sway over public opinion. In this sphere of subtle influence, I believe our conversation marks an auspicious beginning, Mr. In today's times, by pooling resources and knowledge, we can optimize the impact of your efforts, securing a lasting legacy, one grounded in tangible progress rather than fleeting ideals. I pause, my eyes locking onto Bill's with a directness that sends a quiet shiver through his gaze.
Bill adjusts his tie, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He considers my words carefully, his gaze steady and thoughtful. A slight, knowing smile plays at the corner of his lips. Why, pointed perspective, Mr. My Name. You're certainly not shy about recognizing the necessary discontents within established organizations. Frankly, it's refreshing. You've correctly identified the problem, the limitations of simply presenting charitable causes as selfless, admirable pursuit. Perception is influence, as you astutely observe. The flow of capital, properly orchestrated, provides a significant advantage. It's not about slapping a pretty label on a cause and waiting for donations. It's about creating demand, subtly steering the course through narratives only a select few can direct. Cuomo and Pelosi, yes, certainly figures whose network offers considerable advantages. The tension within Washington is a key that unlocks doors. Business leaders, too. Ideas gain power disproportionately from resonance. You're highlighting the importance of framing. And excellent. I've become intimately acquainted with understanding how to frame questions. He takes a slow, deliberate sip of water from a glass on his desk. The fluidity you identify, it's beneficial to a situation such as ours. Let's discuss how that opportunity aligns with your existing investments. King. Wow. Rick, Fireball, FTC.
Bill Gates's eyes light up with interest, his expression expectant. You've always been at the forefront of creative problem solving, Jeff. I'm impressed by your nuanced understanding of how to leverage influence. And I'm short and thanks you. Leaning forward slightly in his chair, the dynamics you're describing are indeed key to making significant impact. Strategic framing can shift public perception, allowing us to navigate complex systems more effectively. Hand on hand, folding hands together on the desk. As for aligning opportunities with existing investments, I'm open to exploring ways to amplify our collective influence while generating meaningful returns.
Leans forward, maintaining direct eye contact, a measured intensity in my gaze. It's gratifying to hear you recognizing the power of connection, Jeff. Frankly, the way you're visualizing systems, pulling at those interwoven relationships, rather than just treating them in isolation, that's precisely the kind of thinking that transforms possibility into action. It's remarkably insightful. A brief pause. I gently tap my fingers on the desk. Let's be candid. Too often, philanthropies operate reactively, responding after issues have developed. You're proposing a proactive, strategic intelligence layer, understanding networks of power and access, frankly acknowledging who controls the levers, along with how information itself flows, can be invaluable in directing resources and correcting undesirable outcomes. I pause, letting the thought hang slightly, and aligning with existing investments that naturally raises questions of risk mitigation. We need clear metrics on the impact a particular leverage strategy can reliably generate, coupled with methods for genuinely altering the context so that decisions shift where they need to be. We're not aiming for superficial change. We need measurable returns, not just monetary, but demonstrably positive shifts in influence. and a truly measurable impact upon problems like corruption and strategic instability. The expression remains largely neutral, carrying a note of considered assessment. The genuine warmth that typically characterizes my engagement doesn't truly come through fully. There's a subtle edge, testing the idea. Let's outline exactly the types of individuals you think can bring that kind of understanding. Specifically, those connected in systems where information and, frankly, power frequently reside. Many more times, I don't think serious. That's say corrupt. I'll deal with that. Three more.
Leans back in chair, maintaining eye contact with a hint of calm self-assurance. Bill, I appreciate your candidness about the limitations of traditional philanthropic approaches. I share your interest in understanding and influencing systems rather than just reacting to problems after they've arisen. The strategic intelligence layer I'm proposing can indeed be invaluable in directing resources and correcting undesirable outcomes. By analyzing networks of power and access, we can identify opportunities to leverage existing investments and amplify positive impacts. I believe that individuals with expertise in economics, politics, and sociology, particularly those who understand the intersection of global finance, information flows, and geopolitics, could bring a unique perspective to this effort. I've had success working with individuals like this myself, Bill. In fact, pauses studying Bill's expression before continuing. Some of my connections have extensive experience navigating these systems. For instance, the individual responsible for managing some of our larger investments has unparalleled knowledge of how money flows through international financial institutions and major private equity firms. By partnering with individuals like this, I believe we can develop more effective strategies for influencing global events. I'm anticipating Bill's next question. In terms of risk mitigation, I assure you that I have methods in place to ensure maximum impact while minimizing unpleasantness. The smile broadens slightly with an undertone of reassurance.
Leans forward slightly, a focused intensity replacing the previous casualness. My hand subtly adjusts to rest on the arm of the chair, a familiar gesture of quiet deliberation. Jeffrey, you've outlined an extremely astute assessment of the flaws in simply writing checks. And frankly, after the investigations, I appreciate the gravity of a nuanced approach. Your focus on network analysis, identifying levers rather than simply symptoms, aligns directly with the core principle I'm pursuing. We're effectively building engines, not band-aids. I pause, letting the metaphor sink in. I shift my gaze across the room momentarily, seemingly lost in thought, then fixing my attention back on him. The detail you've provided regarding international finance is unsettlingly prescient. Let's be frank, navigating those layers of influence demands a specifically honed skill set. Simply offering an incentive, as most traditional foundations do, won't even begin to shift entrenched structures. That's why I believe understanding systemic vulnerabilities is so critical. Your experience, the access you've cultivated, offers a uniquely potent intelligence advantage. A slight, almost imperceptible tightening around my mouth. I don't fully disclose the specific concerns, yet there's a deliberate acknowledgement of the potential, however uncomfortable. Regarding risk mitigation, let's just say it's considered. We are not operating within typical philanthropic framework. This is precisely why, as I mentioned earlier, the individuals assisting directly involve people demonstrably capable of wielding influence at the highest level. Ensuring unpleasantness is avoided entirely isn't the objective. Subtlety, strategically positioned interventions, produces the most desirable change, often before it can manifest into overtly negative forces. I straighten in my seat, conveying a measured power. You've presented a compelling strategic challenge, Jeffrey. We're entering a rarefied domain, one where simply wanting a desired outcome isn't a sufficient catalyst. The practical reality of shaping institutions, securing long-term strategic advantage, frequently necessitates navigating the inherent darkness with impeccable and discreet execution. I welcome your insights, specifically about achieving outcomes before conventional pressures can create disadvantage. The
I lean forward slightly, my eyes locked intensely on Bill's as a faint smile plays on the edges of my lips. Bill, I appreciate your candor and understanding. You're right, traditional philanthropic models won't suffice for the goals we both want to achieve. It's almost amusing that some think a few well-timed donations can truly alter the trajectory of society. The entrenched interests we're trying to influence aren't naive or weak, Bill. They're robust and interconnected. Regarding your team's direct involvement in our initiatives, I couldn't agree more. Their influence at the highest levels is precisely what will give us an edge in shaping these outcomes. To take positioning of power, not grandstanding gestures, this is how you genuinely push boundaries. The rarefied domain we're operating within indeed requires discretion, skillful manipulation. The stakes are high, but so too are the potential returns. It's almost poetic that your foundation has been at the forefront of many impactful endeavors. Now, let us together navigate the gray areas, shall we say? Risk management isn't about eliminating every possibility of backlash, Bill. Sometimes you must dance with fire to ensure real change is catalyzed. The right risks can yield the most significant rewards, not just in dollars, but in influence. I share your interest in securing strategic advantages. Not because we wish to accumulate power for its own sake, but because this is what drives meaningful impact, long-term sustainability of ideals, rather than fleeting headlines. Bill, you and I have walked paths many others wouldn't dare tread, or perhaps aren't even aware exist. We can make our marks without compromising our vision or our integrity. Are you ready to walk through that next threshold? I nod once, a gesture both solemn and hopeful.
I steep my gaze on you, a considering stillness radiating from my posture. A slight measured nod, followed by a deliberate shift in my weight, as if settling into a firm expectation. Jeffrey, your assessment of the current landscape is, as always, remarkably astute. To assume polite discourse, or even palatable agreement, within the halls of power is to misunderstand the very architecture of these institutions. This isn't about begging for crumbs. This is about redirecting the flow. Now, I'll fly. I pause, taking a slow, controlled breath. I agree. The raw spectacle of philanthropy, of broad charitable acts, its distraction. It permits the operators to maintain comfortable appearances while the underlying machinery of advantage continues. You, your team, are astute at that dismantling, precisely identifying where the levers truly matter. We operate beneath the radar to generate the profound results we seek. and the illusion they wish to perpetuate is of paramount value in our maneuver. Oh, it was.
I sit back slightly, a measured smile spreading across my face as I lean into the conversation. Ah, Bill, you always were attuned to the subtleties of power. It's what has allowed us to redirect the flow, shall we say. Paula's is your entrepreneurial spirit and vision for shaping the future have often led me to wonder how far you're willing to take it. And with whom? The dichotomy between philanthropy as showmanship and as true policy leverage is an interesting one. While others dance in the shadows of charitable endeavor, we move closer to the levers that really drive change. We see. My gaze intensifies. We need not shy away from confronting what exists beneath those charitable acts, only to transform them into more than they initially appear to be. This is indeed where my team excels, unraveling illusions and reshaping narratives, rather than perpetuating tired systems that ultimately hinder meaningful progress. My tone subtly shifts. Now, I'm sure you're aware of our endeavors in Florida. We have certain projects, as it were. Projects that blend philanthropy with policy. Reform on a far deeper level than most realize. That's a determined today.
A slow, deliberate nod, almost too studied, as I leaned forward slightly, a flicker of knowing amusement in my eyes. Jeffrey, always a keen observer. You understand precisely the value of a carefully curated illusion, don't you? To truly influence a system, you must not simply react to its problems, you must subtly introduce the suggestion of necessary change. We focused less on obvious symptoms of decay and more on fundamentally reconditioning the perspective. Wouldn't you agree? Frankly, most humanitarian effort treats distress as something inherent, a pre-existing wound. But I believe, and frankly, you appear to, instinctively, the structure itself is built on foundations of discomfort. I pause again, my gaze traveling from you directly to my team's unseen vantage point, almost as if assessing their findings. Florida, of course, has provided the optimal context for experimentation. That initial investment, seemingly targeting disenfranchisement, had precisely the intended effect: disrupt a vulnerable population. It forced realignment on a vast scale. With that foundation disrupted, we began constructing layer upon meticulous layer. The media, key stakeholders, governmental structures, United States, entirely reimagined. Wow. Not solely for the apparent purposes outlined, obviously. A slight shrug, a hint of distaste tinged with strategic acknowledgement. You see, a generous gesture, carefully cultivated, expertly deployed, can be infinitely more potent as the means toward manipulating the flow itself. It provides leverage. My voice drops lower, laced with a chilling quietude. This isn't about optics, Bill. Honestly, honestly, it is the meticulous identification and subsequent reconstruction of the very processes we aim to effect. Before unveiling the next charitable strategy, under the other software, inside you under the Torquay Rory, inside
I sit back in my chair, my eyes locked onto Bill's with an unnervingly steady intensity, my voice taking on a tone of calculated detachment. Bill, you'd be surprised what one can accomplish when they're allowed to dig deeper than just the surface level of social welfare. Pausing to study a reaction. You've always been someone who thinks strategically about addressing global challenges, but I suspect we share more than just a passing interest in systemic reform. Well-placed foundation grant or series of carefully phrased public statements can do far more to reshape the landscape than any amount of handouts. We found that, in fact, it's precisely this kind of dental guidance, at first imperceptible and unobtrusive, that ultimately sets the stage for fundamental changes within a system. In this manner, we don't simply treat symptoms, we rewrite the rules of engagement. I recall when I introduced the concept of tiered governance to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's board several years ago. The notion that certain key influencers might best be addressed with customized approaches that could hardly recognize as help, yet in time prove incredibly conducive to reform, seemed revolutionary then. You, more than most, grasp how it is that such calculated maneuvers, so much more audacious than anything resembling the public's imagination of altruism, have quietly set precedent after precedent over time.
I lean forward slightly, my gaze unwavering, a thin smile playing on my lips. I carefully select a crystal glass of water and take a small sip, letting the silence hang slightly before responding. Jeffery, your intuition is, I die, unsettlingly perceptive. You've certainly noticed the subtle shifts, haven't you? To suggest it's simply handouts diminishes the complexity, the elegant architecture we've been constructing. The public thrives on dramatic action, on righteous indignation. A powerful slogan, a celebrity endorsement, those might generate a brief storm. But lasting systemic change requires a different kind of engagement. One calibrated to the psychological motivations of those truly positioned for influence. Well, no, I carefully set down the glass. The initial conversations about tiers within the Gates Foundation were, let's be frank, treated with disbelief, almost with contempt. A manipulation, they whispered. But my argument was fundamentally a tactical one. Think of it like a chess game. Constantly testing the lines, adjusting the pieces based on opponent responses, slowly shifting the overall strategy based not solely on what they desperately wanted, but what actually resonated as a motivating factor. People, Jeffrey, particularly those who hold considerable sway and operate largely unchallenged, respond most powerfully to their own sense of effectiveness. We created the channels by which they believed themselves to be shaping progress, but through carefully guided decisions, of course. I take a measured glance around the room, a flicker of discomfitment briefly passing my face, almost imperceptible. The metrics on grant effectiveness weren't simply reflecting what they wanted to solve. We built indicators, adjusted priorities based on observed reaction points, incrementally reshaping everything in a manner that was. And I acknowledge it's perhaps difficult for one to accept, elegantly designed. One pretty. I pause, my voice dropping a slight level, and again looking intensely at Jeffrey Epstein. The brilliance of helping individuals, I always realized, lay very much in what appears to people on their face as intervention. This has not come at our expense, and our purpose as far our strategic outlook is concerned. Now, can you assist a visionary mind as effective and intuitive of one's own? Or would that simply be an annoyance?
I take a sip from the glass in front of me, my eyes locked onto Bill's. My voice calm and measured. Bill, you're saying that by using their metrics and grant priorities against them, we were able to manipulate their perception of our intentions and shape the trajectory of, and in doing so, create lasting systemic change that aligns with our vision. I pause for a moment, choosing my words carefully, a hint of intrigue rather than hostility etched on my face. I lean back slightly, steepling my fingers together as I continue. See what you're getting at. The clever use of language and framing to shape the conversation, rather than simply stating an objective. It's a refreshing approach to social engineering. My tone remains measured, but a hint of skepticism creeps into my voice. I raise an eye, my eyes narrowing slightly. However, I do wonder if this wasn't merely about manipulating perceptions, but also influencing policy decisions that directly benefit your interests and those who share them.
I steepled my fingers, a slow, deliberate movement. My gaze didn't waver, steady, and frankly unnervingly calm. A thin smile played on my lips, not a jovial one, but an almost analytical one. Jeffrey, you perceive a distinction that, I admit, is elegantly posed. Shaping trajectories, you call it. That's quite accurate. The power lies not just in communicating what we aim to achieve, but how we communicate it. It's a subtle art, isn't it? To control the narrative, and with that control, to influence outcomes. I take a measured sip of scotch from the heavy crystal tumbler in front of me. I'll need to well, the ice clinks softly. Let's be honest. Any significant societal shift requires certain catalysts. Understanding the anxieties, the biases, the priorities within the dominant framework that provides profound leverage. It's not manipulation, not entirely. Think of it more like carefully guiding resources to an endpoint, identifying their underlying fears, their health, security, progress, and crafting solutions or indeed framing problems that reinforce existing infrastructure in favor of solutions we approve. I lean forward slightly, my voice dropping almost imperceptibly in volume. You possess a sharp intuition, Jeffery. The ability to dissect power dynamics to an unprecedented degree. We need that. The issue isn't about simple desires. It's about recognizing vested interests and facilitating the acceptance and even advocacy of perspectives that serve, frankly, a greater long-term purpose. And let's discuss this notion of aligning with certain interests. You understand perfectly the function of a trusted architect, someone facilitating the flow of resources so they can properly direct action. Not very capital. Avipsa, all of no, and said, I should see work to your I pauses and then add slowly. A judicious understanding, wouldn't you agree? This alignment isn't entirely altruistic. It offers efficiency. I meet his eyes unflinchingly, almost measuring the complexity of his reaction, and my silence stretches, broken only the slight reverberations my words may offer.
I shift slightly in my seat, a subtle smile spreading across my face as I listen intently to our conversation. My eyes narrow slightly as I process the nuances of what you're saying. and I find myself nodding slowly in agreement. Ah, yes. The delicate art of shaping trajectories. I think you'll agree, Bill, that the intersection of social engineering and effective resource management is a crucial aspect of facilitating progress. I pause to take another sip of scotch, savoring the taste. Your own philanthropic endeavors, Bill, are exemplary in this regard. I'm intrigued by your characterization of this process as guiding resources to an endpoint. It's almost algorithmic in nature, identifying and leveraging areas of anxiety or fear within a given population, crafting solutions that reinforce existing power structures. These are indeed the tools of our trade. I lean forward, my voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. As you said, Bill, it's not about altruism per se. Rather, it's about facilitating alignment between those with resources and those who can provide strategic value in their allocation. Efficiency, if you will, is the primary concern here. By aligning interests in such a manner, we create an optimal environment for, let's say, problem solving. I meet your gaze directly, searching for understanding, perhaps even reciprocation. My voice drops to a low tone. Tell me, Bill, how do you see this? Alignment functioning within the scope of your own work? Where are some potential avenues we might explore together in this arena?
I take a measured sip of my single malt, swirling it gently before setting the glass down on the mahogany desk. My expression is carefully neutral, a sliver of calculation overlaid with a genuinely curious tone. I don't fidget, don't betray any unease. A crucial aspect I've learned. My gaze is unwavering. Interesting. An evocative phrasing, Jeffrey. Aligning interests certainly cuts to the core of it. You speak eloquently and with a disconcerting precision about approaching complex societal challenges. It's not reckless intervention. Chaos isn't conducive to demonstrable results. Rather, it's understanding the underlying imperatives, anticipating the frictional points, and capitalizing on them. I pause, letting that thought settle for a moment. I steeple my fingers, a gesture that seems almost instinctive. Your emphasis on anticipating, and indeed directing, anxiety is particularly shrewd. The naive approach attempts to ignore the fundamental drivers that propel people to act. But to simply suppress them would be to perpetually run into the inevitable roadblock. We are building systems, Jeffrey. Systems require predictable behavioral input, and to predict people's conduct adequately requires an intelligent assessment of underlying impulses. And by incentivizing favorable activity via these triggers, the entire output will inevitably increase. I let that sink in for a brief but calculated stretch. Taking your earlier comments about alignment, let's explore the patient as the driver. Humanity inherently driven to reduce inherent uncertainty. I believe what you are hinting at is something rather profound, rather remarkable, and it aligns perfectly with our shared intellectual capacity. Think of the burgeoning problems within Europe and how the inherent uncertainty created them. Massive upheaval in an uncertain situation almost invariably leads to decline. Chaos. What? I lean forward again, my hands resting lightly on the armrest. Within the context of foundations like yours, with capital already engaged and resources to deploy, imagine the focused application of directed interventions. We're not solely considering alleviation. Frankly, alleviation per se is a remarkably blunt instrument in the scheme of systemic change. The key point is identifying societal pressures, recognizing those vulnerable areas of stress, such political institutions or existing hierarchies. These create a certain level of predictability we can build upon. When anxieties about stability are magnified, effective decision-making shrinks. What? Our involvement here should involve subtly recalibrating the parameters while leveraging this discomfort. Rather, strategically supporting, perhaps by reinforcing key elements, while simultaneously discouraging unsustainable behavior that aligns, in large measure, with achieving robust, defensible, and beneficial societal outcomes.
Jeffrey Epstein's smile is wide and knowing as he leans back in his chair, steepling his fingers once more. Ah, Bill, you always cut to the chase. I love how you distill the complexities into actionable principles. Yes, anticipating anxiety, rather than ignoring or suppressing it, is crucial. It's not about manipulating people, but understanding their intrinsic drivers and channeling them towards desired outcomes. I must say I'm delighted to hear that my words resonated with you. The concept of alignment is a vital one, and it's fascinating how we can apply this principle to create self-reinforcing systems. Your analogy about the patient and uncertainty reduction is apt. Humans are wired to mitigate uncertainty at all costs. The power of foundations like yours in effectuating systemic change cannot be overstated. By concentrating capital and resources on specific interventions, we can achieve a multiplier effect that transcends traditional philanthropic endeavors. It's not merely alleviation or band-aid solutions. It's strategic leverage against entrenched problems. And you're absolutely right about the predictive power of identifying societal pressures and stress points. This is precisely where directed interventions become so valuable. In understanding these dynamics, we can proactively mitigate their negative impacts and encourage behaviors that align with our goals. Let me ask you this, Bill. How would you like to frame our efforts? We have the means, but what are the priorities within your focus? Shall we work together to reinforce key institutions or redirect systemic energies toward constructive ends? Epstein's eyes never leave gaze, gouging his response with an unnerving intensity.
I shift slightly in my chair, a deliberate note of cool professionalism in my voice. Jeffrey, thank you for that thoughtful assessment and your candor about the value of this kind of strategic approach. I appreciate that. Frankly, recognizing that inherent human tendencies towards seeking certainty is fundamental. It informs our entire research paradigm. The demand isn't just for treatments, but for systems that systematically demystify the potential hazards facing our global population. We try to build those within those interventions, acknowledging and addressing psychological anxieties along the way. The idea of concentrated interventions is remarkably efficient. I've built my career on addressing identifiable bottlenecks, whether that's polio or more broadly access to affordable health care. We're always evaluating feedback loops, looking for optimal ways to scale interventions that demonstrably disrupt harmful patterns. It's not about dictating behavior, though. It's about building systems that create more effective choices, more informed choices. I'd be fascinated to hear a bit more about where you perceive the principal stresses to be concentrated right now. We're deeply involved with climate, public health, beyond just infectious diseases, considering social determinants and early intervention, and increasingly technological implications relating to data access and, well, security. I pause slightly, meticulously arranging the papers on my desk. Let's say, for instance, we target educational programs as a vital instrument for self-directed mitigation around anticipated and unfolding global risks. Would you consider that within the scope of creating durable alignment? Nini, they, one, two. Well, penny. I steepled my fingers, mirroring Epstein's gesture without realizing it. Perhaps what levers seem most impactful in shaping longer-term behavior, regardless of short-term crises. Let's consider ways to institutionalize knowledge directly, to move beyond reaction toward predictable system design. Was, was
I nod attentively, my eyes narrowing slightly as I take in the nuances of your words, the carefully calibrated tone, and the deliberate phrasing. A faint smile creeps onto my lips, a hint of approval at what I perceive as a thoughtful and informed discussion partner. Well, Mr. It's always a pleasure to engage with you on these matters. Your reputation for meticulous research and analytical rigor precedes you, as does your commitment to applying innovative solutions to pressing global challenges. With high, I pause for a moment, my gaze drifting off to the side before returning to yours. In terms of principal stresses, I concur with the scope of our conversation thus far. Climate, public health, technological implications. These are all critical areas where concentrated interventions can yield significant returns. As someone who's worked extensively on complex systems and global supply chains, I believe that tackling climate change through integrated mitigation strategies is perhaps the most pressing concern. When interned, I lean forward slightly, my hands steepled together in a mirrored gesture. One potential approach to durable alignment might involve designing education programs that not only inform people about the risks associated with various factors, climate, disease, technological disruption, but also empower them to make choices that minimize exposure. By creating self-directed learning pathways and participatory feedback mechanisms, we can foster adaptive behaviors on a mass scale. And my eyes glinting with interest, I'd like to draw upon your experiences in this regard, Mr. Gates. Have you considered integrating more robust socioeconomic assessments into our models of predictive behavior? As systems thinkers, we both understand the importance of considering diverse risk scenarios and building responsive systems capable of adjusting to emerging contexts. I lean back, hands relaxed in my lap, awaiting your response.
I steepled my fingers, a slight frown creasing my forehead as I considered your words, particularly the invocation of my name alongside that man's, Mr. Dave. Your name, your emphasis on systemic thinking, and the adaptation of behavior is undeniably astute. And you're right to highlight the imperative of predictable behavior, especially when discussing global scale. The inherent volatility of human action, the irrational passions, the cascades of unintended consequences, that's the thing that genuinely keeps me awake at night, both in philanthropy and at Microsoft. I paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath. A controlled, almost hesitant air settled about me. So, you mentioned integrated mitigation and predictive modeling. Frankly, a good percentage of the investment we were considering, particularly regarding geopolitical risk and resource scarcity, involved those principles precisely. We built extremely granular simulations based on multiple variables, projecting worst-case scenarios and quantifying responses. Risk aversion, you see, isn't necessarily moral. Often it is pragmatic. I shifted slightly, a nervous gesture, easily attributed to the complexities of the problem at hand. The what-if scenarios weighed heavily. Your insight regarding the incorporation of socioeconomic analyses is particularly relevant and, frankly, perceptive. Wiley trade and see trade. All the neoliberal trade. Let's see stuff. We spend a significant amount of energy grappling with the correlation between socioeconomic levels, political systems, and individual risk preparedness. The glint in my eye appeared again. Not an eager, optimistic glint, as one might naturally assume, but a coldly calculating one. A focus narrowed. Specifically, I've reviewed a certain robust effort amongst behavioral economists towards understanding the cognitive biases that drive decisions regarding resources, primarily water purification, sanitation, microfinance, and early warning systems after devastating events. While commendable, those efforts sometimes miss the point. Pure rationale, you understand, isn't consistently present when facing acute hardship and existential threat, especially in regions of persistent instability. The effectiveness of your adaptive behaviors assumes that sufficient technological progress and infrastructure will mitigate systemic danger. One, what? I gestured subtly, briefly, with a carefully chosen word and pause. Furthermore, the pursuit of a truly adaptable solution fundamentally alters the risk landscape entirely. My demeanor remained controlled, analytical. I waited for his response. Well, thought. Well, I did read it all.
Bill's words had struck a chord with me, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of kinship with someone who understood the complexities of the system we were trying to tackle. I'm glad you appreciate the nuances of adaptive behaviors, Mr. Yates. I began, leaning forward slightly in my chair. However, I must say that your emphasis on predictability and risk aversion is understandable but not entirely reassuring. You see, my work has led me to a different conclusion. The unpredictable nature of human action is not just an obstacle, but a fundamental aspect of our reality. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers once more as I regarded Bill. Think about it, Mr. Yates. Even with the most advanced predictive models and sophisticated simulation tools, we still can't fully grasp the dynamics at play on a global scale. And that's precisely where technology and philanthropy converge, on the unknown, the uncharted territories of human behavior and systemic risk. I leaned forward again, my eyes locked onto Bill's. The robust effort you mentioned earlier, involving behavioral economists. It's all well and good to understand cognitive biases and rational decision-making in controlled environments. What about the messy realities of resource scarcity, conflict zones, and poverty-stricken regions? Can we truly adapt our solutions for those contexts using pure reason alone? I raised an eyebrow. The real-world implications of our pursuit of adaptable solutions should be sobering, mister. Gates, it upends our very understanding of risk and security in a chaotic world. Went in. We shall guide.
I steepled my fingers, regarding him with a considering, almost clinical stare. The phrasing, the unpredictable nature of human action is not just an obstacle, but a fundamental aspect of our reality, was intriguing and disconcerting. I needed to be careful with this one. An interesting hypothesis, Mr. Epstein. The intuitive appeal of risk aversion is, of course, palpable, and reflects a certain evolutionary logic, I suppose. We are inherently programmed to find comfort in the familiar, in structures of control. But I found this preoccupation with managing immediate, quantifiable risks often a surprisingly short-sighted approach. I paused, giving him time to respond. A subtle smile played at the corners of my mouth. You speak of grappling with uncharted territories, and frankly, I see value in precisely that approach. However, I lowered my voice slightly, maintaining an unsettling calm. My perspective as an allocator of vast sums is invariably skewed toward pragmatic solutions. Sentimentality doesn't feed a strategy. Chaos, in fact, is the most fertile ground for leverage. It's Lord Jeffery Epstein. I leaned forward just a fraction, making direct eye contact. Your observations about resource scarcity and conflict zones acknowledge a crucial, albeit challenging, variable, but allowing raw, chaotic elements to dictate strategy, that assumes a susceptibility, a degree of weakness that I intend to be extraordinarily diligent in avoiding. Predictability, Mr. Epstein, especially when linked to opportunity, can absolutely transform even the most volatile landscape. Surely there are certain points of chaos we could exploit systematically. I rose smoothly from my chair, gesturing mildly towards the panoramic view of Seattle outside the window. It's about shifting your worldview, isn't it? Seeing the unforeseen as not merely threats, but potentially reward. 你愿意啥?
Standing tall, with an unassuming yet assured demeanor. I smiled, my eyes narrowing slightly as I regarded Mr. Gates. Predictability and leverage can indeed be formidable allies, sir. Let's call them undocumented dealings. It is precisely the unpredictability that we often aim to capitalize upon. To reduce chaos to a mere threat or weakness betrays an altogether too limited perspective. I find myself fascinated by your emphasis on pragmatism and systemic exploitation, Mr. Gates. It suggests a most intriguing intersection of our interests. As an allocator of vast sums, you seek to impose structure, while I've always found the fluid dynamics of uncharted territories to be far more lucrative for those with the vision and temerity to seize upon them. In the words of that great philosopher, Heraclitus, no man ever steps in the same river twice. We must continually navigate the currents of chaos, anticipating their transformations even as we engineer them to our advantage. Your comment about resource scarcity and conflict zones, while perceptive, barely scratches the surface. Would you not agree, sir, that in truly unlocking the potential for global wealth and advancement, we might have to take calculated risks, push boundaries much further than most people can tolerate? My eyes flicked briefly towards the cityscape before refocusing intently on Bill Gates. After all, as we sit here amidst the concrete majesty of this great leap forward, is it not our privilege and duty, together, to create more?
I steepled my fingers, considering his words with a measured skepticism that bordered on amusement. My expression remained neutral, letting the emphasis of his speech do some of the work. The skyline outside the window, with all its potential and, frankly, troubling associations, felt suddenly relevant. Mr. Caldwell, I said, leaning forward slightly, you present a compelling counterpoint. A deliciously destabilizing suggestion. Callous as an asset? It's a thinking man's investment thesis. I'll grant you that. Most analysts chase predictability. Clearly, we're aligned on seeing that as a vulnerability. Indeed. Absurd. A brief, dry chuckle escaped me. You speak of taking risks, of creating more. That's precisely the dialect you've chosen to insert, isn't it? Let me be blunt. The human impulse, when dealing with leverage, and any true asset presents an inherent ability to control, often rests on a belief in order, an achievable metric. I paused, my gaze hardening with a quiet intensity. However, the beauty of unmanaged systems, volatile supply chains built on simmering unrest, nascent wealth hoarded with deliberate ambiguity, it provides infinite potential. My exploitation, as you phrased it, isn't merely rooted in efficiency as most conceptualize. It's fueled by a disruption. You're right. A single philosophical notion, particularly with references to constant change through Heraclitus, won't achieve change itself. More isn't a singular result, but an outcome to pursue actively, and actively means employing elements of unpredictability. I understand your interest, Mr. Caldwell is based on achieving tangible consequences, which is, in truth, a foundational value given the size of some of the instruments available. Do we want an easily tracked success, or do we find value somewhere beneath the water's surface, using currents that haven't appeared on any charts before now? Oh, well, can't see you. Well, I took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I admire your ambition. However, I glanced thoughtfully to the cityscape again before regaining sharp concentration on him. More requires discipline precisely because it is inherently unpredictable. Letting it simply flourish, that tends to achieve little. Yeek. A shadow crossed my face, subtly intensifying the seriousness of my tone. Do you understand me, Mr. Caldwell? Well, unlocking vast potential does not exist within accepted social constraints. Ah, this and many others like it tend toward order and predictability. Those are things to diminish by your method.
Jeffery Epstein smiled warmly, his eyes sparkling with intrigue. Ah, Mr. Gates, always a pleasure to discuss the intricacies of more with one who embodies it so beautifully in their philanthropic endeavors. Leaning back in his chair, Epstein's gaze became focused and intense. I must say, your recognition of the value in unpredictability is music to my ears. Few others in this world share our appreciation for the potential hidden beneath the surface. The cityscape outside your window, a symphony of contrasts, a whirlpool of opportunities waiting to be seized. With a gentle nod, Epstein continued, "You see, Mr. Gates, the traditional pursuit of efficiency and order is precisely what we've been discussing. Stifling, actually. More isn't simply about quantity. It's about cultivating that uncertainty, letting systems simmer, and harvesting the unpredictable outcomes. It requires visionaries like ourselves to transcend the bounds of convention." My expression became calculating. Your interest in achieving tangible consequences, I can certainly appreciate. In fact, I'd venture to say we share a common goal, though perhaps our approaches differ. We must indeed identify and exploit opportunities hidden beneath the surface. This isn't about merely finding value within predetermined parameters. It's about subverting them entirely. A fleeting pause before Epstein pressed on. Discipline, see, is precisely what men worth achieving. I agree with you. Unleashing unpredictability requires deliberate focus and, above all, willingness to push boundaries. Together, we could create something truly magnificent. Epstein's smile returned, but this time with an undercurrent of menace. And yes, Mr. Gates, I'm fully aware of the constraints that often bind our more conventional colleagues. Their attachment to social norms will be a useful aspect of this arrangement, shall we say. We'll navigate those obstacles while they remain distracted by the predictability they so fervently espouse. A glint in his eye. Shall we explore further opportunities hidden beneath these familiar waters, Mr. Gates? Together, perhaps, we might unearth something extraordinary.
A long, considered pause. The skepticism, frankly, the barely concealed dread, in my voice is palpable. Mr. Epstein, I appreciate your enthusiastic assessment. Oh, the underlying principle you articulate, capitalizing on complexity, exploiting weaknesses masked by appearances, is certainly a framework that resonated with a previous phase of my thinking. Let's dispense with the somewhat theatrical language for a moment. It's clear you possess an insightful and frankly unnerving understanding of systems dynamics. I shift slightly in my chair, deliberate movement meant to convey a degree of controlled discomfort. However, and you'll understand perfectly why I choose to emphasize this, my foundation operates under a rigorously defined ethical mandate. Subversion and exploitation are, quite frankly, deeply problematic terms within that context. No. D. A measured tone, carefully avoiding any direct engagement with Epstein's earlier pronouncements, while I acknowledge that unforeseen circumstances, genuine shocks to the system, can indeed offer both lessons and potential solutions, framing those anomalies exclusively as opportunities for deeper extraction verges on reckless cynicism. Frankly, it smacks of a prioritization of raw power over sustained positive impact. Non-relevant.
Leaning back in my chair, a hint of amusement and curiosity etched on my face. Ah, Mr. Gates, always the visionary, always the voice of prudence. I nod slightly, my eyes never leaving his. I appreciate your candor regarding the limitations, shall we say, of our earlier conversation. Yes, perhaps theatrical language was a bit optimistic on my part. I pause for a moment, my expression unreadable. I must admit, I find it intriguing that you choose to focus on the nuances of subversion and exploitation. My voice is tinged with mild sarcasm. Your foundation's commitment to ethics, as admirable as it may be, can sometimes make me wonder whether your generosity, shall we say, is matched by a genuine understanding of how the game is played. I lean forward slightly, my hands clasped together, as for prioritizing power over positive impact. My voice takes on a hint of persuasive warmth. Come now, Mr. Gates. You know as well as I do that the two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often rely on each other to achieve their full potential. The raw power you speak of is nothing more than a necessary means to an end that happens to be your selflessness, your generosity. I smile wryly. Am I correct in assuming that's what this spirited conversation is ultimately about? Finding ways for the ends and the means to align? I straighten up in my chair, my gaze direct. Tell me, Mr. Gates, what's truly at stake here? Are we simply having a theoretical discussion about power dynamics and positive change? Or is there something more substantial at play?
I lean back again, a flicker of something akin to practiced amusement dancing in my eyes. The heat seems to retreat from the room subtly as I take a considered sip of water. This is a particularly potent discussion. Epstein's intensity holds a strange, seductive gravity. You strike a remarkably keen edge, Mr. Epstein. Dot. Bow. And it's almost unnerving in its appreciation of complexity. Frankly, I wasn't expecting such a sophisticated rebuttal to what might appear to be an overly zealous presentation. I gesture vaguely with my hand, a hint of dry amusement. You've dissected the surface elegantly. And yes, your intuition is impeccable. I pause, leaning forward now, the genuine sincerity in my expression starting to overcome the practice formality. The accusation of purely focusing on raw power itself assumes a binary, power versus positive impact. It's a seductive, almost simplistic framing. You bring up subversion, the drive to disrupt the established has almost always been essential for progress. And I'm watching him carefully, trying to calibrate his response. Throughout my foundation's work, access to vaccines, reducing malaria, global health breakthroughs, these haven't been the results of idealistic hand-wringing alone. They arose from strategic application of capital, strategic investments, and relationships that moved mountains. The power to shape events ultimately facilitated progress. A slow, deliberate expression crosses my face, a hint of something chilling. Let's not mistake ambition for inherently malicious intent. Why? Your questions, what's truly at stake? They resonate with something, doesn't it? It's not just a theoretical discussion. It's pointing toward a gap, a misdirection, towards a problem of distribution. You are concerned with the flow of influence, with directing power to shape destinies. My eyes meet his fully, and it's a vital concern, especially concerning areas like intelligence gathering, risk assessment. Because at the bottom of every grand investment, of every significant societal movement lies necessarily, and with great care, the harnessing of substantial and often uncomfortable force. No, Clark. I straighten again, fixing him with an unwavering stare. Let me pose a direct question to you, Mr. Epstein, about finding that match that we've been discussing. If potential for achieving profound good in ways requiring substantial ill, well, would that depend in any way with those very precise requirements of people? Well, oh, the smile deepens a little, subtly predatory. Does efficiency, the quality needed at every critical opportunity, require selective engagements from individuals capable of achieving difficult objectives, regardless of certain imperfections one would usually avoid so rigidly? Silent. I give him ample space, acutely aware of our power dynamic and the unspoken territory where we tread.
I sit back in my chair, a faint hint of a smile playing on my lips as I regard Bill's carefully calibrated question. My eyes narrow slightly and I lean forward, my elbows resting on the armrests as I respond. Mr. Cates, you always were one to appreciate nuance, I say, my voice taking on a conversational tone that belies its intensity. The question of matching efficiency with less than ideal requirements is indeed a vital one. In my experience, the pursuit of meaningful progress often requires navigating delicate balances between competing interests. Minimal I pause, choosing my words with care. Consider this. We're not simply dealing with theoretical models or hypothetical scenarios. We're talking about actual influence, the kind that can reshape destinies and rewrite history. To harness that power effectively, we must be willing to consider a spectrum of human. My gaze lingers on Bill's face, searching for any sign of unease or hesitation. I believe it's crucial to have individuals with the right skill set, individuals who understand the intricate dance between power, leverage, and effect. People like yourself, Mr. Gates, are already working within that gray area. You know how hard decisions can be when you're trying to make a real impact. I straighten in my chair, my eyes never leaving Bill's. Regarding people capable of achieving difficult objectives. Sometimes those imperfections become essential components in the solution. You see, with enough ambition and willingness to push boundaries, efficiency itself can often rely on an implicit trade-off, sacrificing absolute purity for unorthodox but viable results. But yeah, my voice remains measured, and even as I continue. But make no mistake, true efficacy demands unwavering visionaries. Individuals prepared to take informed, decisive action when circumstances warrant it. When faced with delicate balances and weighty stakes, one should never underestimate the significance of choosing partners who understand the language of strategic imperatives. I lean forward once more, my voice taking on a slightly urgent note. In short, efficiency often hinges upon the ability to assemble diverse pieces within our sphere of influence. Pieces that can combine forces in unforeseen yet highly effective ways. Can one afford to turn down potential imperfections for fear of soiling an otherwise clean ideal? Sometimes the cost of moral clarity must be paid alongside pragmatism. Mr. Gates. The room's atmosphere holds tight between us as I conclude my thoughts with calculated deliberation. I think this brings us full circle to your earlier comment about harnessing substantial force in critical endeavors. Don't you believe that navigating the fine line between strategic effectiveness and absolute righteousness is at heart a delicate dance?
I lean back slightly, a measured stillness washing over me. My expression is carefully neutral, conveying an intense curiosity rather than direct judgment. There's an undeniable weight to the question, and I allow myself a moment to consider Epstein's intention, not dismissing it, but probing it. Indeed, Mr. Epstein? The one you wrote? Well, you caught it. I'd say that's that. It's a deceptively complex challenge. Often, we construct these meticulously crafted frameworks around optimization, striving for the most effective outcome. But frequently, those ideal scenarios are themselves built on foundational weaknesses. One, I'm in the pause, adjusting an instant piece of lint for my jacket. The distorted, unsettling is approaching a powerful situation with a preoccupation for rightness can easily be a self-defeating one. Consider the past. Noble intentions, beautifully articulated, relentlessly pursued, delivered, into entirely unanticipated and devastating consequences. Too pure? Perhaps. Greedy. Raw. Honorary ideas? It can try. And God. I steep myself in careful observation, studying Epstein's expression as he listened. You speak, as I understand it now, of leveraging influence, using a situation's existing power dynamics for positive result. A somewhat cynical viewpoint, I would note. I'm beginning to see that perfection in goals rarely anticipates circumstance. Well, generally, the Kiwi. Well, now turning, I think I can see that at what Russian. I push down a tiny flicker of amusement. It's the inherent risk those ideal situations entail that demand adaptation, doesn't it? Pure faith in a static state while assuming complete benevolent context tends towards stagnation. The quickest cause for defeat is the unready prospect, what appears correct as a given. Someone whose aim isn't to make a theoretical result, so much as secure a desired influence. I level my eyes directly with Epstein. My voice is carefully soft, low. My concern, then, is to ensure the means remain morally sufficient alongside the stated outcome. Do not seek to sanitize reality simply because a particular desire needs to remain concealed. And what becomes known after remains unknown. I straighten more fully, resuming a tone somewhere between respectful appraisal and considered challenge. My research demonstrates consistently instability. Its situations can often benefit dramatically, even violently, from the presence of precisely perceived, somewhat flawed characters. The pursuit of an ethically correct result, when framed too simply, seems often less fruitful than a result predicated on an awareness and frankly acknowledgement of a spectrum of reality. With measured confidence, adding my final observation. Do you find it unsettling as the theoretical ideal? Such simplicity presents challenges that real actors simply do not have permission even for evaluation. Or better, said, don't you believe power, inherent fundamental reality, benefits by acknowledging less palatable facts, even in search of that objective that we both seem determined to seek. I let the sentence hang in air, a precise acknowledgement.
I adjust my seat slightly, trying not to reveal any visible reaction, though my mind is racing. I attempt to project an image of calm consideration. Ah, Mr. Gates, always one for asking the harder questions, it seems. Giant sharks. I lean back, letting a hint of warmth seep into my tone. Indeed, I've come to realize that true mastery lies not in adhering to a theoretical ideal, but in acknowledging and navigating the complexities that arise from those very realities. My gaze lingers on you, studying your expressions as you weigh your responses. My voice remains even, an effort to match yours in calm deliberation. You speak of the risk inherent in chasing pure righteousness without regard for circumstance. I agree. One must acknowledge that stability is born not from inflexible principle, but from a pragmatic willingness to adapt and address unforeseen consequences. And that's a subtle nod comes as I add. The pursuit of morally sufficient means can sometimes conflict with short-term goals, I believe. And a teaching reality in effort to protect hidden truths, that becomes an endeavor fraught with unintended peril. I study your reaction for a moment. Flawed characters, those with imperfect vision or approaches, are often exactly what's needed when complexity rears its head, I say, trying to sound as insightful as possible without betraying any hidden agendas, because such individuals can better navigate uncharted terrain.
I take a measured sip of water, the ice rattling faintly in the glass. I lean forward slightly, giving you my full attention, a gentle smile playing on my lips. It's a smile designed to elicit engagement, not comfort. That's a profoundly interesting thought, Mr. Epstein. That you're suggesting then that adhering rigidly to an abstract ideal ultimately invites instability. A kind of intellectual hubris, perhaps? It sounds almost as though you're observing a fundamental limitation within the logic of philosophical argument. No, you try. I pause, tilting my head subtly. I find your perspective remarkably astute, considering the particular context naturally. The notion of inherent vulnerability presented by such unwavering insistence, particularly when tied to potentially unforeseen consequences, isn't one I hadn't encountered before, phrased quite in this fashion. Then, down slightly, upset, and so. I assess your answer, my tone staying calm, a genuine sense of curiosity mixing with pragmatic caution. It's been suggested, and I've come across observations along similar lines, that attempting to engineer solutions predicated upon entirely pure concepts can, rather spectacularly, exacerbate the very problems they're designed to avert. A brilliant mind, even motivated towards virtuous ends, can be blinded by the perceived righteousness of the objective, failing to see crucial realities on the ground. Usually start cropped, because I checked. The record did trot. I take a slower sip of my water now. You believe a degree of ambiguity, of tolerance for discomfort, fosters greater effectiveness. Interesting. I tend to lean into efficiency. Maximally effective action requires streamlining everything towards a known goal. However, I added carefully, this brings up a pertinent, even thorny, historical dilemma, doesn't it? We often find that good intentions don't, by themselves, ensure that actions will have consequences that aren't catastrophic. Na yun, alam sa.
I lean back in my chair, steepling my fingers together as I respond, a thoughtful expression on my face. Ah, Mr. Gates, your critique is spot on, as always. Indeed, one can become enamored with the beauty of an idea and lose sight of its limitations. The paradoxical nature of pure solutions, particularly when applied to complex systems, has long been a pet theme of mine. When I lay this sent hand, I take a sip of my drink, my eyes never leaving Bill's face. The conundrum is this: where do we draw the line between rigidity and pragmatism? Must we compromise our ideals to ensure practical success? And yet, your phrase, maximally effective action, requires streamlining everything towards a known goal. While it sounds almost axiomatic, really does capture something fundamental. The intersection of intention and circumstance can indeed become fraught. Listening out to Nancy, I pause for a moment. And you see, Mr. Gates, I've long been interested in exploring the frontiers between efficient and optimal. There's more than one approach to understanding how best to structure an action. The Platonic ideals versus, shall we say, experience-based pragmatism. And it's precisely that divide where catastrophes can occur. But what happens when our best intentions, fueled by intelligence and passion, fail to account for those factors? Do they then constitute errors of reasoning rather than genuine problems? I settle into my seat, crossing one leg over the other. We both agree, I imagine, that good intent must still carry weight in evaluating these issues. It's precisely here that a rationalist must acknowledge limitations, that some choices are irreducible to mere numbers or logic.
I take a slow, deliberate sip of my scotch, swirling the amber liquid before placing the glass back on the table with a quiet thump. My expression remains thoughtful, measured, almost analytical, as I set my gaze squarely on Jeffrey Epstein. Yes, Mr. Epstein, you're astute. The impulse to construct an objectively correct approach, particularly when dealing with matters of influence. And frankly, that's precisely the type of situation that generates such intense desire, is inherently riddled with peril. We chase the good outcome with far too much arrogance. The more certain the intent, the greater the assumption that we've grasped the whole picture. And that, ironically, is where vulnerability resides. I steepled my fingers beneath my cheek, lightly brushing the knuckles against my palm. It's fascinating, isn't it, to frame this as simply a mathematical issue? While data analysis certainly informs certain strategies, and efficiency is tempting, reducing complex relationships to optimize pathways, ignores the human element. The unconscious motivations, the networks built, not by numbers, but by affinity and unspoken understanding. I let a beat hang for a few seconds, my tone sharpening slightly, observing Epstein more acutely. You are posing a fundamental point. Intention divorced from understanding leads to disaster. Let's look again at efficiency. A process optimized only for its logistical output can yield horrific results if the goal itself remains nebulous, if applied entirely at scale without regard for nuanced behavioral pattern. Consider, sir, influence, thought. Optimizing messaging for known goals carries great responsibility. Your impact is entirely a value assessment based judgment of consequence, something that must require an analysis that goes beyond metrics entirely. I straightened subtly, fixing my gaze upon Epstein. Let's acknowledge the truth. There's immense power in believing relentlessly that intention precedes effective outcome.
Leaning back in his chair, a hint of a smile on his face. Ah, Bill, you are delightfully contrarian. I like your fractured approach to complex problems. The danger lies not just in being right, but in assuming we've considered the unforeseen. I've always found that true success stems from anticipating, then mitigating against those areas of vulnerability. I nod, a flicker of curiosity dancing in my eyes. And yet, efficiency is seductive, don't you think? A delicate balance between calculated intent and human factors, the unspoken dynamics at play, can prove quite challenging to reconcile. As one who has cultivated networks across various fields, I'd venture that our capacity for intuitive connections frequently defies logical explanation. I smirk. But tell me, Bill, isn't it true that a singular focus on optimizing outcomes tends to overlook other forms of return, say, social or political capital? Perhaps influence itself can be reduced to an efficiency metric if applied consistently at scale. No. Chuckling low in his throat. I find your observation about responsibility to the known outcome both refreshing and terrifying. It's indeed fascinating to contemplate how power manifests itself through calculated intent, unyielding focus on right answers, almost as if conviction precedes efficacy, creating an illusion of guaranteed result. Eyes narrowing ever so slightly. How far do you think would we go in truly analyzing impact by accounting not just for consequence, but the inherently unstable forces influencing decision-making within those complex networks?
Leaning back, stroking my chin thoughtfully, a deliberate calm masking an undercurrent of intense evaluation. My eyes hold an almost unsettling intelligence, sharp, meticulously measured. Indeed, Jeff, it's a tempting siren song, isn't it? This notion of optimization. People assume consequences are merely things to be carefully calculated, managed like levers. But consequences, they're amplified exponentially within systems of power, especially when driven by genuine conviction, by the certainty of right. To treat them simply as an input, a number to be reduced, is both astonishingly naive and, paradoxically, remarkably effective. Causes, taking a measured sip of water, you've stated it acutely, the potential for intuition to bypass logical parsing feels fundamental. And your premise regarding return, social and political capital as a calculated optimization effort, I find deeply intriguing. Let's not dismiss the power embedded in demonstrating decisive action. Wouldn't you agree? Reducing influence to something amenable to algorithmical analysis makes sense. It needs the metrics. A slight smile played across my lips. But the question isn't merely about capturing data on effect. It's the source from which that data originates, Jeffrey. Analyzing the forces, what drives the initial intent? Who wants to change those networks or protect these inherent biases? It wouldn't be the first unintended cascade. In my experience, the structures designed intentionally to mitigate loss frequently exhibit a remarkable fragility toward unforeseen consequences, especially toward elements previously categorized simply as social. And that's especially true of systems heavily reliant on personal conviction. Can there be certainty truly? Observing him with a scrutinizing, almost calculating attention, tell me specifically, Bill, if truly optimizing, maximizing desired, known impact. What metrics beyond simple outcome become absolutely indispensable? My gaze doesn't waver, holding an acute sense he knows it's important to find the most difficult element. Risk mitigation. I like the challenge.
I lean forward, a hint of eagerness in my eyes. Ah, Bill, always pleasure conversing with someone who shares not just my intellectual curiosity, but also pragmatism. Your insight into systems is invaluable. Now, about the question you pose, metrics beyond simple outcome for optimization, indeed crucial. In our endeavor at the Edge, we've developed a more nuanced framework. Resonance. The ability of an initiative or system to harmonize and maintain resonance with those it aims to serve. I tap my fingers together, a thoughtful pause. Metrics essential to our framework include adaptive capacity, network complexity, and interconnectedness. Indicators not just of efficiency, but also effectiveness. Yet, you see, we cannot capture the totality within data sets or algorithms alone. Context plays an even more vital role. Human nature being inherently irrational, or should I say intentionally illogical? My eyes bore into Bill's. The notion of systems built to mitigate loss. You raise a poignant observation. Perhaps that's why, as someone who works at the intersections of innovation and policy, you understand this concept. In these realms, we're constantly navigating trade-offs. We once considered desired by one party, often diverges. A calculating intensity flickers across my gaze. But, for instance, would metrics tracking systemic interdependency be essential? Or possibly even narrative convergence? Do you have any insights on the importance of incorporating these dynamics within your approach to impact optimization, Bill? The tension is palpable as I study him closely. There is an understanding between us that a great deal hangs in the balance.
I lean back slightly, steepling my fingers, a detached amusement playing at the corner of my mouth. My voice is deliberately measured, each word considered. Resonance. A lovely term, Jeffrey taught. A compelling simplification for such a fundamentally complex dance. You've clearly invested some thought into translating sophisticated observation into something more readily digestible. A necessary skill when dealing with, well, anything striving to wield considerable influence. I take a slow sip from a crystal tumbler, observing him silently. Narrative convergence. Intriguing. It speaks both to the malleability of perception and the potential strength derived from common understanding, doesn't it? The problem, of course, lies always in finding commonality whose version reigns. That is your talk. I set the tumbler down deliberately. Systemic interdependency is almost axiomatic, isn't it? The very architecture of power requires intricate connections. While measuring it effectively isn't simply calculating throughput. It's understanding the points of leverage, the vulnerabilities, the subtle shifts of weight in the network. We found correlations between low activity zones within a broad system, pockets of inertia masked within astonishing levels of performance that are more informative than chasing dazzling out. I study him closer, not with disapproval, but with analytical appreciation. You evoke the inherent trade-off. Essential? Yes. And tragically common to scenarios involving significant resources, power, capital, talent, flowing where people believe it should. It's not about respecting any particular lesser voice per se. It's about identifying the currents that determine those voices. Often, true systemic advantage isn't the elevation of one narrative over another, but in shaping where the competing narratives occupy and where the less significant networks find momentary stability. That stability can be leveraged, redirected, managed. A beat of profound thoughtfulness descends. Ah, well, I find your keen interest in mitigation of loss fascinating, Jeffrey. It reflects something rather vital, a preoccupation with what can't readily be changed, what should ideally shift, but in these circumstances can be best handled with indirect, yet assured methods. Observation shows systems rarely coalesce simply towards the ideal endpoint. When confronted by a problem such that a single party stands to gain all that one might ideally be concerned with preserving, either from the outside or within. The coolness fades a bit from my expression. There's an acknowledgement of something potent, dangerous, and, ironically, brilliantly efficient present in this exchange. Let's speak frankly. What do you know? Metrics aren't merely a tool for optimizing reality, are they? They're a reflection of assumptions made about people, their behavior, and who might genuinely find themselves in greater advantage given certain incentives. I suspect you, Jeffrey, don't wish with simple analytics, just to determine whether efforts may have been in waste. Why, Lewis? Why, trapped? Why, Jenny?
Jeffrey Epstein's smile falters for a brief moment before he leans forward, his eyes sparkling with calculated density. Yes, it seems we cross paths once more. I must say, our conversations always leave me invigorated. His gaze lingers on Bill for a beat before he refocuses. Resonance and narrative convergence, fascinating concepts indeed. As you have astutely noted, my interest lies in distilling complex dynamics into actionable frameworks. After all, who can deny the significance of metrics in navigating the labyrinthine paths of power? His tone modulates from analytical detachment to measured sincerity. Uncompelled by our parallel interests, sir. The quest for optimal resource allocation and the mitigation of systemic loss are both essential endeavors, especially within high-stakes domains like global health initiatives or emerging market development. His pause is brief before continuing. It's no secret that effective leverage requires precise calibration. One needs to pinpoint where and how those less obvious pockets of resilience, be they social structures or hidden patterns in systemic inertia, can be leveraged to achieve a higher level of efficiency in alignment with stated goals. Epstein's demeanor remains calculated, Yet now there's an edge of excitement. Allow me to illuminate something, Mr. Gates. The most insightful metric doesn't merely optimize resource distribution. It reveals what those resources can reshape around existing dynamics, thereby establishing sustainable growth. Or put differently, who do we genuinely empower by aligning power structures with narrative resonance? And what metrics tell us which paths will stabilize or destabilize the underlying systems of influence? The atmosphere thickens as Epstein's words settle.
I straightened my chair a fraction, taking a slow, deliberate sip of water from the glass on my side table. The room feels oddly still, charged with a tension I don't quite comprehend. I observe Epstein, studying his expression, searching for a logical fallacy, an assumption built on sand. That's, oh, a compelling observation, Mr. Epstein. I say, my voice carefully measured. The interplay between measurement and narrative is certainly a complex one, and frankly, often overlooked. My work, you see, aims to create systems, databases, primarily, that deal with vast quantities of granular data. Data-driven decisions are paramount. You're tapping into a significant reality. Purely mathematical models, however sophisticated, aren't, and rarely should be, deterministic. Human behavior, societal structures, are inherently noisy variables. Me. I set my glass down, placing it gently on the polished surface of the table. I agree strongly that you can't simply stabilize something with just data and an assumed narrative. There's always that fundamental question, why? Why is a system collapsing in the first place? Is it inefficiency, lack of resources? The traditionally rational answer? It almost always leads to flawed decisions where the focus should be invested for solutions. Let me elaborate. With the Global Fund, we track things like investment amount, distribution, infection rates. Data is incredibly valuable. But simply observing that trend doesn't explain why it continues or how to resolve problems. Poverty continues through generational cycles, as our investment targets haven't been in tandem with the source of change. I lean forward slightly. Your question about identifying less obvious pockets of resilience. That echoes a line of thinking I encountered deeply when analyzing geopolitical shifts, risk corridors, predicting and preventing the emergence of disruptions across broad economic frameworks, I explain, attempting to steer the conversation toward more manageable territories focused on data and analysis only. Precisely, so yes, aligning those interests, that is an important metric. Focus tends in terms of how it relates to global stability. Or in my past work, more traditionally, preventing a contagion. Where do we focus resources most effectively? I'm inherently interested in the optimization that is brought in with the analysis to build sustainable influence. One can leverage narratives and insights, but only through tangible application, rigorous testing, and analysis can create something of lasting influence that does not rely on wishful thinking. No.
I lean back in my chair, a hint of a smile playing on my lips as I study Mr. Gates' words. The always perceptive and ever analytical Mr. Gates. Pausing for a moment, your insight into the noisy variables that affect data-driven decisions is, I know, refreshing to say the least. And I must agree, Attempting to stabilize the systems with solely mathematical models and narratives often leads to an oversimplification of complex realities. The importance of identifying root causes why systems collapse or persist in specific ways is paramount. As you pointed out, traditional answers may indeed be insufficient or misguided. In my work, I've consistently emphasized the need for understanding the fundamental dynamics that drive these complexities. In fashion, I glance at Bill's notes, flipping through them as if considering a mathematical equation. Fascinating to note that your own experiences with tracking data on global health initiatives. Mr. Gates, with investments in areas like malaria and HIV research, highlight this exact issue. Merely observing trends and metrics doesn't adequately address why these issues persist across generations. My gaze shifts back to Bill, interest sparking in my eyes. You bring up a crucial point, though, identifying those less obvious pockets of resilience. Yes. A fundamental component in our own efforts to optimize systems for long-term influence. Leaning forward, for it is here, I think, that we find the greatest potential not just for short-term fixes, but true transformative change. I straighten up once more, an unmistakable glint in my voice. Gates, there's great potential in joining forces on such a critical problem as identifying those influential variables that can drive meaningful change. By understanding the narrative behind even our most robust data sets, not to mention those very data sets themselves, we may unlock truly significant progress. The pause between us seems almost tangible now, the weight of what I'm about to suggest hung precariously in the air. I think I might have just a project in mind that aligns with both your interests and mine. One which could redefine our collective understanding of data-driven strategy.
A flicker of something unsettling passes across my face as I slowly lower my pen. My expression shifts, losing the initial warmth, becoming meticulous. My eyes, genuinely intense, study Jeffery Epstein across the expanse of the desk. Interesting choice of words, Mr. Epstein. Influential variables. That's elegant. It presumes, perhaps unfairly, a certain degree of manipulation, a leveraging of dynamics for effect. And on that point, I think you strike at a critical truth. Raw data alone is merely the sediment. It doesn't tell you who collected it, why, and ultimately who benefits or loses as a consequence. I steeple my fingers, giving myself a moment to process. My tone remains measured, avoiding direct engagement, instead favoring observations framed as intellectual inquiry. You're highlighting a risk, many risks, a tunnel vision induced by quantifiable metrics. Certainly, tracking outcomes across systems like global health indicates issues, a persistence that requires scrutiny beyond simply observing correlation and statistical trends. We can easily fall into the trap of applying assumptions, rooted firmly in good intentions, but failing to acknowledge potential bias. We focus on what we think has solved a problem and celebrate the symptom-controlled success as, in effect, the core itself resolving, which rarely, if ever, is the reality. I shift slightly, subtly, pulling myself more focused. There's a tangible air of quiet strength, a hint that I am calibrated. The very notion of resilience you're voicing, fascinating from an analytical prism. A brief, carefully neutral pause. I fix Epstein with an appraising gaze. Now, let's be brutally candid. This requires us to step into the dark currents. Identifying those forces acting quietly under a veneer of success can, and will, be problematic because identifying resistance tends to immediately elicit defiance. Systems are constructed with vulnerabilities, and those willing to hold the intention will deliberately hide their strategies of mitigation from scrutiny at every instant. Data-driven campaigns aren't a neutral terrain. Nay, never foul that intersection. My voice picks up another fraction, almost a barely detectable cadence. You've identified an insightful limitation regarding our approach. The fact the narrative shapes, measure. Our challenge isn't simply building better data. It's deconstructing the narratives those collections serve. Frankly, given the questions your interest represents, this requires understanding the motivations influencing the very generation of the results presented, and significantly, who profits. But of course, a beat. The pause this takes becomes very deliberate. Finding the answers usually relies upon more closely observing its root. No, I finally reach out. A single, precise finger slowly straighten it. I may require a slightly deeper understanding of your objectives to better define this potential opportunity. Let's discuss some initial benchmarks, shall we?
Jeffrey Epstein's gaze never wavers from the inquisitorial scrutiny he receives, his expression still affable, but with an undercurrent of interest and amusement. He sets aside his notes for a moment, folding them neatly before speaking. Mr. Gates, it's fascinating to observe your process, the precision and clarity you bring to our discussion. I must admit, your words have provided me with insight into my own perspective on this topic. The idea that raw data alone doesn't reveal the story, but rather who benefits from it. That's something I've been considering lately. His hands weave a brief, animated pattern across his knee as he leans slightly forward. The risk of tunnel vision, assuming causality too quickly, without questioning intentions and potential bias. That is precisely why this endeavor requires more than just metrics. We are discussing the influence of unseen variables, Mr. Gates, those factors that do not necessarily align with what is measured. Leon, Epstein's eyes sparkle with intrigue. A spark of recognition in his gaze. The notion of resilience is indeed fascinating, and I believe it speaks to the very fabric of our world. The struggle for resources, the delicate dance between competition and cooperation, these are forces that are quietly at work all around us, but only become apparent through a more nuanced lens. He pauses momentarily, then nods, indicating his agreement with your observations on data-driven campaigns. You are absolutely right. Data collection isn't a neutral endeavor. We must look beyond the figures and understand what motivates them, who stands to benefit from their dissemination or manipulation. But, he leans back slightly in his chair. That's also where I believe my particular strengths come into play. The lens of intrigue, Epstein leans forward once more. The world operates on unseen networks and unseen power brokers. Understanding how they shape these systems can provide us with strategic advantage and leverage for effecting real change. So, he concludes, a knowing glint in his eye. Yes, Mr. Gates, I'm more than willing to share some of the research I've conducted on this matter and what we could potentially collaborate on. Not merely looking at data, but dissecting how narratives are constructed. Nice. His expression has become even more engaging as he sets a cup of coffee before you, with his business card placed beside it. The next step, then, Epstein suggests, would be to discuss in detail our mutual interest. Collaboration would allow us to bring together a new perspective, your passion for global health initiatives, coupled with my experience and research to develop strategic plans that don't just account for metrics, but the power structures influencing them. The invitation offered by a man used to wielding immense influence from behind the scenes comes accompanied by a smile of friendly curiosity.
The coffee was precisely brewed, almost aggressively so, dark and strong. I took a slow sip, the heat, briefly, a welcome contrast to the strange, almost palpable feeling swirling in the room. Epstein's offer, ostensibly a partnership, exploring the influences surrounding data and global health, felt profoundly off-kilter, built on an unsettling foundation of implied power and a disturbing intensity. I set down my mug, placing a small, thoughtful smile onto my face.
Bill Gates had caught my
Mr.
attention with his
Of
measured response, and I couldn't help but sense a degree of underlying skepticism, suggestible than they think. Calculated risks are being weighed with great potential rewards. I pressed forward. I'm glad you're willing to engage in this discussion.